This is Gotham Investigations, and I'm your host, Jeff Giordano. Mark Sievers, sentenced to death for a murder for hire for his wife. But what happens to those murderers that served their time and are released back into society? Most of us look at it as a revolving door because they go right back in. But we're going to meet an individual that has to give a go-ahead for those individuals to be released back into society and to allow them to have parole. Stay tuned. You must see this episode. This is Gotham Investigations, and I'm your host, Jeff Giordano. The mitigation of Mark Sievers, till death do us part. An individual that was sentenced to death for the murder for hire for his wife. What happens with hundreds of other criminals arrested for murder that are released back into society? Many of us say it's a revolving door. Once they're out, they get back in again. We're going to meet a special guest today, Vincent, who faced these murderers eye to eye and would give recommendations of them making their parole and being released back into society. Vincent now is a prominent personal injury attorney that works on some of the most high-profile personal injury cases. Vincent, if somebody wanted your services, if they got injured for a car accident, a slip and fall, how would they contact you for your services?
Thanks, Jeff. They can call me directly on my phone at 305-731-9269, or they can always email me at vincent@floridakeyslegal.com.
Fantastic. And you do all of the state of Florida, correct?
All the state of Florida.
Fantastic. Now, that wasn't always your career. You had kind of a prominent career working with the criminal justice system. Today we have about 323 people that are sitting on death row. What people don't realize is about only 2% of those individuals will be put to death. A lot of them will die in prison. And some of them, through appeals, they might get released into the general population doing life in prison. And from there, some of them, through other appeals, may be eligible for parole someday, as well as other murderers that are serving their time and they just come up to the whatever it is, 7, 10, 20, 30-year sentence and released back into society. Tell us about the program you worked for, and also tell us about your thesis paper that you did.
Sure.
And what that was based on.
First, Jeff, thanks for having me to discuss an issue that often goes unforeseen. It's individuals in the criminal justice system fall in the shadows. It's not necessarily something that gets a lot of, that is brought to light quite a bit. And it's an interesting, at least for me, it was an interesting kind of journey how I fell into that. I would have never thought that I would have been, associated in any way with the criminal justice system, or at least working, or being involved in prisons. But it started, I'll take you back a little bit from the beginning, is I was a student at Florida International University back in the late 90s. And I had a professor, Sharon Lowry, who was a sociology professor, and she taught classes on social deviance, criminology, serial killers, etc. And I got to enjoy her classes. And while I was in grad school for sociology at FIU, she had a unique program which was called the Respect Program, and that took place at ECI, which is the Everglades Correctional Institute. And what it was is once a week, students from FIU were able to go to ECI and meet in essentially a classroom with individuals that were there for life in prison for either murder or very serious felonies. And so once a week for about 3 hours, you were in a setting in a classroom where there was no guards, and it was just 25 or 30 individuals with the professor, Dr. Lowry, and a handful of students. And it was a very unique situation. You don't really see that very often. And over the course of a few years, while I was in grad school and even after, I would go and I would meet with these individuals and basically talk about the circumstances that precipitated the arrival into prison, and to hear their stories. And eventually the idea of the program was, if some of them were ever able to get out either through some type of appeal or through parole, the idea of that program was to kind of help ease and their reintegration back into society. And that's kind of what the idea was, the Respect Program. And so while I was there, we had this idea of I did a thesis in grad school, and the thesis was called, it had to do with minimum mandatory sentencing. And my question was, was there a significant difference as far as the incarceration of people of color versus non-people of color, essentially? Were more minorities in jail as opposed to non-minorities? And that was kind of the question that we kind of explored.
And what was the answer to that?
And what was interesting, because it depended on the kind of research you did. If you did a quantitative analysis, which is basically just looking at numbers, then the answer is fairly simple. The majority of individuals that were incarcerated were minorities. And then if you did a qualitative answer, was the reason that, or actually let me explain it this way, is the reason that they, what was essentially the reason that they were essentially behind bars? And if you did a qualitative research, which was essentially doing interviews and trying to find out the reasons why they were there, the reasons were much different when you did interviews of the individuals. So we had a statistically significant sample size, and we had individuals there that were able to perform all kinds of surveys, and we weighted these surveys. And the research, when you did a qualitative analysis, was striking, that it wasn't necessarily the color of your skin that determined if you had a sentence that was more harsh, but it was your access to private attorney. So if you had money, or if your family had money, that's what determined generally whether you had a better deal or not. And that's what I found out through a lot of the interviews. And there's a lot of examples. We had one individual that he was in prison because on New Year's he had gotten in a fight with his partner, and he killed his partner over drugs. There was an issue about money, and they got in a fight and he killed him. The family was able to hire an attorney, and they negotiated a deal for a 10-year sentence, and he was going to be out in 6. So I remember meeting him and talking to him, and I got to know him over a couple years. And he was not somebody who was stressed out. He was somebody that was there, that was generally more relaxed, knowing that there was the end in sight when he was going to get out.
So you're basically saying that the skin color really doesn't have anything to do with incarceration. Money factor steps in.
In my narrow situation that we looked at, while I'm sure maybe it has something to do with incarceration rates, the sample size that I was looking at and all the individuals in that particular area, if you had access to private counsel, you had a better deal. So while there may have been some degree of prison or punishment that's warranted for whatever crime that happened, the outcome was vastly different if you had private attorney. It doesn't mean that public defenders aren't good. They're excellent. But you have, a lot of times, they're overwhelmed with the caseload. They've got hundreds of different cases, and you don't have necessarily the resources and time that you can put towards a certain case as opposed to private attorney. Private attorney, families got money, they can hire experts, they can do investigations, they can really work on the particular case. So at the end of the day, you're able to generally, not every time, but you're able to usually get a better outcome because of the work that's being able to put into the particular case. And that had to do with essentially, the color was green, that was essentially the color of justice. There was your access to a better deal had to do with if you could have access to private attorney, you generally got a better outcome.
So on a separate, unrelated study, that was recently done, it came out with 90% of blacks and Hispanics actually have a higher chance of falling backwards on the economic ladder rather than moving forward to, say, from middle class to higher middle class. So that kind of puts them back into that category where access to attorneys.
Sure. I mean, and that was one of the issues we looked at too, was the recidivism rate too. And that's a question, is once you get into the system, meaning that once you're in jail or you're in prison and you get out, the recidivism rate is high. It's in 70, 80%. It's fairly high. And then the question is why is that? Why is the recidivism rate higher? Is it because there's lack of economic opportunity? Is there a lack of jobs? Is there a stigma associated with the fact that you were in prison? And that's one issue too, is when you look at job applications, the questions that are asked they're very, very limiting. For example, some questions are, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And that's any crime. That could be a misdemeanor. Or if you're ever convicted of a felony. If you're convicted of a felony, it becomes very, very difficult to be able to to be employed. So then the problem is lack of economic opportunity based off of this threshold that's there as far as you having to disclose your past, make it very, very difficult, and it kind of lends itself to where you have this snowball effect of where people kind of fall back into problems, fall back into trouble because of lack of economic opportunity, because of some of the, this gatekeeping function of having to disclose your past, which I understand, the employer gets to know that, but then it really becomes a real issue. So then you look at, all right, well, what can you do? Can you expunge or can you seal some of your history? And the problem is that the Florida statute, I forget what number it is, has a list of crimes that you can expunge and seal. And there's a whole list of offenses where you can't do that. And then the question is why is that? Does the legislature have some kind of incentive to make sure we're keeping people safe from criminals? Or is it simply, but maybe that's the case, but then as a result it eliminates access to employment because you can't expunge or seal records, and so you get this slippery slope.
Well, here's the problem I have with that. We do background screenings for major companies that do like 60 employee screenings a month. My history being a police officer, I kind of know you don't want these individuals working for you. Of course, schools, they have different requirements that they can go through, but under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, I've even got cussed out by some of these attorneys from these organizations that you cannot put this in there any longer. It's supposed to be within the 7-year period. So you might have somebody that fell out of that 7-year period about a month for convicted of murder and got out, but that crime occurred 7 years ago and a month or a day, and we can't put it on the report. And we can only put felonies. So, one of the things I do is I always contact the head of HR, and I'm like, you might want to look at this. They're not convictions, but they have 3 or 4 armed robberies that they were arrested for. I don't have that in my record. You don't have that in the record. Do you want this individual working for him? Now, by law, federal government, you cannot base your hiring requirements on that. How do you feel about that?
It's this balance between, the ability of the employer to do whatever they want to do versus versus possible discrimination against somebody. And so you run into, the employer saying, look, I don't want anybody that's been accused of a crime, because the problem is, and this is one of the things you go into when you do jury selection in criminal cases, is you ask people, how do they feel about somebody being arrested? And sometimes you run into answers are, well, they assume that because somebody was arrested, they must have done something wrong. And so it taints that your perception of that person forever, essentially. And so if you're, so if the questionnaire is, and I've seen these, is, have you ever been arrested for anything in your life? You could have been arrested for murder. You could have gone to trial and been exonerated and found not guilty. But good luck trying to be hired by that person, because there is this overwhelming, stereotype that if you arrested, you must have done something wrong. So on the one hand, the employer has a right to know who they're hiring, because the employer has liability. What if they hire somebody that injures or harms someone? The employer's on the hook. But then at the same time, let's say you're an individual. How do you get on with your life, and how do you maybe get out of the cycle of falling back into trouble and being able to kind of achieve some economic independence if if there's not an ability to, if you always have this essentially a sword of Damocles, a sword hanging from a thread following you over your head at all times. It's a very tough situation on both sides. It's hard.
Well, let's throw this back in your lap as a personal injury attorney. And being a police officer, I would always tell the HR directors and stuff, your first line of defense is hiring this person, because right there you could nip it in the butt. So now let's say we hire somebody and has a history of violence, arrested for aggravated battery a couple times, whatnot. Maybe it was past the 7-year period. Maybe within that 7-year period, arrested 2 or 3 times, violent crimes, but they're dismissed. So we cannot put it on a report. You, as a personal injury attorney, what happens if this individual has a workplace violence episode and that individual that's injured hires you? Can that come back and kick them in the ass?
Sure.
That they have this history of violence and now they were hired by this organization?
Sure, because the standard in the civil case isn't going to be criminal. Criminal is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a fairly high standard. Civil, it's a lot less. It's more probable than not. And so in discovery, where the rules are very liberal and you're able to find out all kinds of information, one of the things you get to ask a defendant, somebody you're suing, is have they been convicted of any kind of felonies? Have they ever been charged with anything? And that comes out. And so in trial, you're essentially you're allowed to ask somebody, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And then the answer is, and they only have to answer yes or no. But think about it. You're a juror and you're sitting there and you're trying to determine whether somebody's version of events, it's a swearing match between two particular witnesses, let's say the plaintiff versus the defendant. And the defendant in that particular case was somebody working for a company who had a felony conviction 7-8 years ago. While on the one hand, you may not necessarily be required to disclose that. In trial, if somebody asks you, have you ever been convicted of a felony, and the answer is yes, that will, the idea is that taints that person's ability, that it's going to taint their credibility in the jury. At least that's the idea behind that. So it can be very damaging, at least on the civil end, because the rules are a little bit different.
So what happens with these individuals in a program that you were in? Suppose somebody was not eligible to, say, 2030. Do you do reports on these individuals? I kind of see progress. I kind of see that there is potential for him 10 years down the road, and where they would look at this when his parole comes up and they see all these reports and they see that he's moving forward with these programs such as the one that you were involved in.
And that's the idea, right? Because if they have a crime that's eligible for parole, there's a parole board that the state of Florida has, and they're going to look at the different factors that help determine, are they going to grant parole? And some of the things that inmates can do is their behavior while they were in prison. What did they do? And a lot of times to maximize their effort to get parole, a lot of inmates, they'll sign up for courses because there's a lot of things that are available that the state of Florida will subsidize, whether it's college credit, vocational training. You can do all of that stuff. So the idea is if they load up a bit on that and they have good behavior, and you essentially don't necessarily have the victim's family that are opposing it, that's going to maximize your chances before the parole board. One of the things that they would do with the program that I was involved in is they would discuss that they would meet, they'd be part of this program, and we would then, if necessary, be able to indicate, what kind of growth they had. And what's interesting is when I was doing this was in the early 2000s. I was just I was a student at that point, and I've been an attorney now for coming up on 18 years. And I will get letters and requests by family members, either by email or actual letters in the mail, of some of those same individuals that were in my program who are now coming up for parole, and they will ask me to write a letter on their behalf. So I don't ever know everything that the parole board will use to take that into consideration. But then I, even to this day, will write a letter that indicates, look, this is my experience with this individual. They were attentive. They were very good participants. They were good as far as interacting with the professor, with myself, with the other students. And you do that in an effort to show that they are worthy of reconsideration for being paroled. And what I think is interesting is this, every few years I get somebody contacts me, and it's been 20 years now.
Do you keep in touch with some of those inmates through mail back and forth?
Some of them I do, because to this day, I'm a guest speaker with my former professor, Sharon Lowry. I still go to FIU about once a semester, and I'm a guest speaker at her criminology, social deviance, juvenile delinquency classes. And one of the things I enjoyed about her classes is that she would always have individuals that were coming guest speakers, and she still has to this day. Some of the individuals that she had known through that program, some of them had gotten out and were able to succeed and reintegrate back into society. I remember one individual had spent quite some time in prison and was able to get out and worked for a very large retail chain in Florida, and went up through the ranks and is up as a regional supervisor. I mean, he's made it, and he comes to her classes every couple of years and talks to the students. So every now and then I will, one of them will reach out to me, but it's it happens, but just it's a little bit more rare now, just given the time that has gone by.
Sure. Well, during my police career, and I'm still in the reserve program, but I was a hostage negotiator for 10 years, so I went a couple hundred hours of psychology courses and stuff. On some of the negotiations, the 90% of them are husband-wife disputes that might end up in a murder. They might end up with something. The majority of them end up in a divorce. But I always some of the cases that were successful negotiations, I would keep in touch with the individual, see how he's doing, and I would talk to him. They would see a mental therapist sometimes. Human factor would check in. I wouldn't just be like, get out of there and that's the end of the story. So, because we don't want to get called back there either. But most of the individuals will say they're seeing a therapist, and some were in their 40s and 50s, and they were saying that what their therapist is telling them, it's hard to deprogram an individual that's 50 years old because he's been programmed for 50 years. So now you have to deprogram and desensitize that he might have been like raped as a child. He might have been experienced domestic violence with his parents. His parents might have been alcoholics, and he lived with this all this time. So you have to kind of go through the acceptance stage. How do you deinstitutionalize an individual that's been in jail for 30 years, 40 years, and get them ready to go back into society? Cell phones, the internet, different cars. It's kind of like walking into the Jetsons when you were a kid, a world of the Jetsons. How do you do that?
And that's, I don't know if you can do that because, for example, the resources that you would have available to, and let's say you're an individual and you get out and you've been in there for 20, 25 years, right? You're not immediately going to be employable because of the fact if you're a convicted felon, that's going to follow you. And then you have to see what kind of resources would a state have to subsidize and allow you to reintegrate back into society. Obviously, like you said, mental health is going to be something of primary importance. So then you'd have to find, if you qualify for Medicaid, if you qualify for any kind of health insurance, is there any kind of program out there that the state of Florida is going to subsidize to allow individuals to reintegrate back into society? And I'm not aware of anything in particular because probably that's not something that is of great voting interest if you're a politician. If you're a politician or you're a legislator and you're going to run on something, usually felons' rights or the ability to be social services like that isn't something that probably trends super high in politics. So you're not going to get a lot of lobbying for dollars in that area. But what do you need? Well, you're going to need mental health. You're going to need therapy. And the problem, too, is let's say a lot of the reasons that people allegedly committed some of those crimes that resulted them in the prison, you're going to need help for that anyway. But then when you're in prison, a lot of times it's not exactly like it's a great environment either. A lot of times people will say that being in prison, they learn to become, better criminals because the subculture that exists in prison is crazy. I mean, you have, there's this kind of black market of trade and crime that happens within prison. You've got corrupt guards. You've got, if you've got money, you can get anything in and out of jail. And so you would think that, all right, if the idea of putting somebody in jail is to reduce recidivism to where they're not going to reoffend again, what happens in jail kind of it's not the best system to do that because you become a better criminal or you're not getting the help that you need. And then when you're let out and you go back on the street, there's no systems that are in there to help you. And so you're in this cycle, and it's almost inevitable that you fall back into problems because if the idea is you're going to pick yourself up by your bootstrap and just do it on your own, I mean, sure, that could happen, but that's probably very, very difficult considering that 25 years go by, you're now back into society, but you've never fixed any of the problems that you have. And I don't think that there's a lot of social programs out there that are really available to individuals on a subsidized basis to help them reintegrate. So it's this circle.
I don't even want to refer to people that have been in jail for 20, 30 years incarcerated. Mark Sievers, for example, I'm a pretty good judge of character. I sit there, I look at like on interviews, interrogations, you get the baseline. You try to see when they answer questions, how they react. You get to see when they're nervous on answering questions. So even though it wasn't my role, personally, I wanted to kind of get a feel is he guilty, is he not guilty? Not that it would matter as far as the work that I was doing, but my role as a mitigator was to keep him from getting the death penalty. So this trial took about 4 years to happen. And I came in at the end. They went through a couple of mitigators before me. So I couldn't establish a baseline with him because I basically met somebody that was behind bars in solitary confinement in a pretrial detention center for 4 years. And pretrial detention centers are probably some of the most filthiest, violent places, yelling all night long. So it could be somebody like me or you that just get arrested and we're put there on a crime like this, awaiting for a trial. And obviously our mental state, if he was to be found not guilty, to enter back into society. Have you done anything for individuals that are in pre-trial detention centers? Some of those trials can take 4 to 7 years. They're incarcerated all this time. Do they get any help talking to therapists?
I mean, this is the problem. Let's assume that the crime that you're charged with is not one that allows you access to any bail. So you are remanded in custody, and you're sitting there, and you're in jail essentially until you can go to trial. And you're in there, and let's say you're deteriorating. The medical care that prisoners are entitled, or when you're in jail, you're entitled to certain medical care. You've got civil rights. You have, if you have medication, they're supposed to give you medication. You're supposed to have medical care while you're there. If you're not provided with those types of essentially civil rights, you can essentially sue, right? But now you're in a civil case, you're suing in the federal government, and the laws are very government friendly, even though you have, compared to the rest of the world, you have rights that maybe don't exist elsewhere. It's still, it's a very difficult burden to overcome. So you're entitled to health care, but if you don't get it, you can sue, but then think about it. Now it's taking a while to try to get any relief through the courts.
So when you say healthcare, you're considering therapy part of healthcare?
I'm considering part of it, yes, but I don't know. I don't think that there's that much as far as in the healthcare the pie. As far as there's a very small sliver that is entitled to health care, that's entitled to mental health care while you're sitting in jail as far as medical care. So if you need medication, you need drugs, that's different. There's money there to dope you up and to stop keeping the animals from being too restless, so to speak. But as far as sitting down and talking to a therapist, I don't believe that the state of Florida has allocated a significant portion of their health care budget to that while you're in jail, or even if you're in prison afterwards.
And how about your own, mental health? Being a police officer, pulling up on accidents, shootings, it kind of takes a toll on you. Putting yourself in that position behind bars, you kind of see the other side of life, and yeah, you do kind of get a relationship of sorrowness because you hear their stories, raped as a child, you hear their stories, beaten as a child, so you realize that society hasn't been a friend to them.
Correct.
And now they're behind bars. What impact did that have on you in your life when you leave that jail and you go home to your family?
It was, so the first time that I had really ever been to a jail or a prison was when I was doing that program at Everglades Correctional Institute. And so, you're fairly desensitized to jail, crime, things like that. And but when you get in there and you see that you're walking into a jail and you're talking to individuals there, everyone's in a jumpsuit, and it's very regimented, and you're going in there and you're talking to individuals. And the idea is a lot of times people are predisposed to thinking, well, if you're in jail, you must have done something wrong, right? And that's it. Like, everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. You don't, and that's it. It's black and white. It's open and shut. But then you start talking to some of those individuals, and assuming what they're telling you is the truth, because you don't really have a whole lot of way of knowing that, but you kind of hear the same story that exists that precipitates their arrival to jail. Is you have some kind of problem at home. You have either abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, parents that are not there. You have mental health problems that are undiagnosed, untreated, and that's the common theme. And so it is incredibly sad, and you see that, and at the end, I go home. I would get in my car and drive away, and some of these guys you're talking to, they're never going home. And that changed my opinion of not to judge a book by its cover, essentially, is everybody's got a story that precipitates their arrival there. And yes, I understand that there's victims, and I'm kind of just focusing on the why did that person do what they did, and you would see a common thread, and that common thread was problems at home, things that happened when they were young, whether there was, usually a lot of mental health abuse, physical health abuse, and that kind of precipitated their arrival. And that was that was hard to hear, because you're hearing this and you're looking at somebody face to face, and you're looking in their eyes, and they're telling you the story and assuming that this is accurate. It's pretty heartbreaking to hear that, and it's heartbreaking because of what they allegedly did, and it's heartbreaking to know that this is what happened to somebody that, when they're younger, nobody probably thought this is where they would find themselves. And that's what would happen a lot, probably in what you run into as far as mitigation, is when you go in front of the judge and it's a sentencing, and you have to explain what are factors that would influence the judge's decision to either accept the recommendation of both defense counsel and the prosecutor or deviate from it one way or the other. You often will see people that come in, probably such as yourself, doctors, therapists, family members, that will go in and explain, and the theme, it's a common thread. It's those issues that happen when they were younger: physical abuse, mental health abuse. And then you run into the judge, is that something that they will take kindly to? Does that deviate? Are they going to deviate from sentencing? Are they going to go up? Or are they going to go down? And then that's kind of the luck of the draw, the judge that you have. But yeah, it changed my opinion of, when you talk to somebody, don't judge a book by its cover. You don't know the circumstances that existed. And and I think that helps you even when I was doing some criminal defense, and even as a lawyer in general, is it kind of gives you a little bit of an appreciation of what somebody went through, that maybe explains the reason that they behave the way that they do.
So we have a contract with the state. A lot of private attorneys do as well. Whenever there's a conflict, say two defendants, one is tried through the public defender's office, the other one is able to get private counsel paid for the state. They're able to hire an investigator, which they do. Plenty of them out there. We have certain attorneys that we work with, but sometimes these attorneys are actually attacked behind bars. You'll see additional charges going on when these people get pissed off. Have you ever been faced with a violent confrontation from any of these individuals directly?
When we would do criminal defense work, when I did, when I spent a good amount of my time doing that, it's no shortage that as an attorney, you're going to run into clients that either are unhappy, they're angry, regardless of the work that you're doing. They have they don't agree with your theory of how to help them. They don't agree with your roadmap. They get upset, they get angry. You would sometimes have that on individuals that, criminal defense that had criminal charges. I ran into that a few times where they would get upset. They don't like the direction that you're going. We never had any kind of threats with physical violence, because the majority of the cases that we would do, we would have a handful of felonies that we would defend, but a lot of them was at the the misdemeanor route, which was the different type of charge. And yeah, you have to manage expectations. What I would run into is, and this is probably like in all cases you handle as an attorney, is you try to present a roadmap. You give individuals your recommendation. You tell them, look, I don't think we should do this or do that. They still want you to press that way. It doesn't work out the way that they wanted. They come back and they get very, very upset. That's probably all attorneys have run into something like that. But as far as physical violence, I've been fortunate not to run into that in a criminal defense setting with any of our clients.
Now you mentioned when you did criminal defense, it's important that you bring that up, because I think you still do some criminal defense work. So if somebody out there wanted to reach you, not just for personal injury, but on a defense case, they're arrested for something or accused, I mean, what a better person to have on their side than somebody that knows the system, knows how to talk to the judge, how to explain the history of this. But what percentage, or do you even know the percentage, of individuals that are released back into society that return?
I think the literature for the last 20, 30, 40 years where this has been studied has said that the recidivism rate is high. It's got to be in the 80% range, 70, 80%, which is It's very significant. And so the idea is, and then the question mark is,
Now, are those just on violent crimes or
that's just
all crimes?
crimes in general. Crimes in general.
Okay.
So then the question is that just simply an individual problem that if you're quote unquote a criminal, you've been charged with a crime, you spent time in jail, that's just, you're more predisposed to doing that? Or is it when you get out, we don't have systems in place that help eliminate that from happening again? But the recidivism rate has been fairly significant. It's been fairly steady, and it's been fairly significant. And then there's all kinds of theories as to, why that happens. How do you change it? But,
Have you ever looked at, say, percentages of individuals that are incarcerated for 10 years are like 60% more likely to return. 20 years, you're 80-some% likely to return. Or individuals that are released in 2 years, only 2 or 3% return rate. That maybe it's the incarceration time, the institutionalization that makes them return.
I know that there's research out there that discusses that. I haven't looked at that in a very long time, as far as peeling back the layers of the onion with respect to what cross section of jail sentence or prison sentence will determine whether you're more likely to reoffend. But I think it's pretty consistent that if the longer you are in jail, it's the lack of access of economic opportunity when you get out kind of makes it more likely that people are going to reoffend or get themselves into trouble. And another problem too is when they get out, a lot of times if they're out and there's some condition, there's some parole, now they've got a probation officer. And that makes it very difficult, because even if you have one simple technical violation, so for example, you're let out, you're on work release, or you're out and you have a parole, and you've got to, let's say, touch base with your probation officer, they call you, you don't pick up right away. They could you could have a technical offense on your probation, and boom, you could be thrown back in to prison. And that's where a lot of people have problems.
I've heard a lot of cases like that. They're in an accident, they're getting gas, or just an accident on the way, traffic, and you could have a good probation officer that's working with you, that's trying to actually help you.
Yep.
Or you could have one that's playing a numbers game and it's just an ass.
Got an axe to grind, and they're taking you down. And that's the kind of the luck of the draw on the probation officer that you have. But that's a real issue too, is in the criminal cases that we run into, a lot of times we would have clients in the past where if we can, allow them to resolve their case without a criminal conviction, so the fancy term is adjudication being withheld, and allow them to have some kind of small jail sentence in exchange for no probation, some clients are happy to take that because probation is a leash and it's always there. And if you're going to reoffend, depending on the area that you're in, some judges do not take kindly to that. And then you're going to get right back in the system, and you're going to have a penalty that would have been worse than what you would have had maybe when you started. And so some people aren't built for the requirements that exist with probation. And so that's a real problem too, is probation.
Certainly, your experiences began late in life when you were in college and you got part of this program, and it kind of changed your life, the way you view people, the way you see things. You mentioned programs outside. I just think, being a police officer, more and more programs. We do it with the gang detail. We do it with gangs. We try to put them in positive environments. But high school kids should be brought to these negative environments and talk to these lifers. And how do you get there? And what caused this? So they could say, this is a place that I don't want to be. Yeah, take them to the zoo, take them to the nice field trips, but it should be mandatory that every child has a visit to the jail, sees what goes on behind bars, and they can literally tell themselves, I don't want to be here.
You have a lot of times where you have former felons that have gotten out, and that's what they'll do. They'll go to high schools and they will talk to, they'll talk to student body at the classroom to kind of, and it makes it real, because it's, everything you see on TV or on your phone, you're desensitized to it, especially.
Well, it kind of makes it real, but there's a difference between a criminal going to the Rose Garden
right.
of a school giving a presentation, between a child going on a field trip on a bus,
right.
behind the bars, being walked through the cells, having everyone yell at them.
Yeah.
Now they're sitting in an open environment. They see all the orange suits there, or red suits, whatever they might be, the trustees, they're going to be, I don't want to come here, rather than an individual that, he's out and things are working fine for him. Oh, maybe I can go there one day. It's not that bad being arrested. Look,
No,
he made
that's
something for himself.
that's a good point, because if you're in the comfort of your auditorium or you're in your classroom and somebody's telling you how bad it is, okay, you appreciate that because it's somebody telling you that. But having to visit facilities, that's not someplace that the majority of people really have ever been. And so, it is. You're walking in there and it's a different environment. People are yelling at you. I mean, it's a little bit of a free-for-all in there, and it can be a very scary scene. And I think that there's a certain deterrent effect from that, for sure.
Now you have inmates that you said contact you all the time, but have you ever had an inmate contact you when they were released? Vincent, you want to have some coffee? I'm out now.
Outside of clients, obviously if on criminal cases you establish a rapport with your clients, and a lot of times they come back for other services that you need, or they just keep in touch with you. As far as individuals that I got to know when I was part of that program, you would have a few that would reach out to you on occasion, but it was very, it didn't rise to the level of wanting to meet up or anything like that. It was just simply, if they had questions, I told them they could reach out to me, and I would, help them in, any way that I was able to. So you run into that. As far as wanting to meet up in person, I haven't run into that yet.
So even though, like you're saying that there's programs in place, the way, talking to you, that there's not enough programs in place. So you yourself, do you see this as kind of a broken system where there's a lot more to be fixed?
It's two ways to look at it. Option one is you need to put more money at the problem, right? So you need to have more and more programs. And then you wonder, if you do that, is it going to change anything? Because you look at maybe, and then the example to look at that is you look at Europe. Europe has a very different approach when it comes to corrections. They have more social programs in place. And I don't know this, but I'm wondering then, is the recidivism rate different in Europe because there's more access to social programs? Or the other option is that it doesn't make any difference, and the problem is it starts at home at an early age. And so regardless of the money that you're putting towards helping somebody when they get out, it should be redirected towards access to social programs, welfare benefits, anything, it's kind of a social safety net when people are younger so that they avoid the situation to begin with. And they're two very different ways to look at it. They're two very different schools of thought that go with it, of these programs don't matter, people are broken, or no, there needs to be more money put in so that there's more of a social safety net when they get out. And I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's probably a little bit of both, right? I think if you could have a situation set up to where maybe you have a bit more access to mental health care to people when, let's say, before they ever even get in touch or brush with law enforcement, and then when they get out, the problem is when you get out, now it goes back to what we talked about earlier. You have the employer has a right to know where you've been and who they're hiring, versus the individual getting a clean slate. And I think it's definitely a broken system, because felons' rights and prisons and all of that is not something that polls very highly when politicians want to run. You take polls, it's not really high on anybody's list. So because of that, you're not going to probably get a whole lot of traction when it comes to putting more money into the system for that. So I think I think it's probably a generalization, but I think the system is a bit broken because it's it's more of the same.
Gotham Investigations, Rehabilitation, releasing the most violent criminals back into society. Subscribe, give us your thoughts on this, and stay tuned for our next episode. Are you a fan of our show? Do you like our show? Then comment, hit the like button, and subscribe, or you might be the next one we investigate.